The year was 1869, and the northern Rockies stood like jagged knives against a frozen sky. Snow ruled that land, wind howled like a restless spirit. It was a place where men either grew iron in their bones or disappeared without a trace. High in a forgotten valley lived a man named Elias Boone, 50 years old by count, 70 by sorrow. His beard hung thick and silver, his hands were scarred from traps and axes and winters that tried to kill him every single day. His eyes carried the color of an approaching storm, blue, gray, distant, unreachable. Elias had not spoken to another soul in nearly a year, not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. Long ago, back in Missouri, he had been a different man. A laughing man, a hopeful one. He had been engaged to a woman named Lillian, who once told him she would follow him anywhere. Ha ha ha, what foolish promises youth makes. 2 weeks before their wedding, she married his cousin instead. No warning, no explanation, just a letter folded in careful handwriting. That night, Elias packed a single bag. By sunrise, he was gone. 25 years later, he had built his cabin stone by stone in a valley no map bothered to name. He trapped, he hunted, he survived. He told himself he needed nothing more. This was his peace until the storm came, late October. The sky turned the color of iron. Snow threatened to swallow the mountains whole. Elias was checking his trap line when he saw movement below, two figures stumbling up the slope. At first, he thought they were deer. They weren't. They were women. One fell to her knees, the other tried to lift her, barely able to stand herself. Elias felt irritation first, then something else, something dangerously close to concern. He muttered under his breath and started walking down toward them, rifle slung over his shoulder. He did not yet know that those two women would shatter the silence he had guarded for 10 long years. And he certainly did not know they would one day stand in his cabin and say the words that would shake him to his core, "Choose one of us." But that moment was coming. Before we step deeper into this storm, make sure you subscribe, like this story, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if love asked you to choose? Because what Elias Boone chose changed all of their lives forever. And the blizzard had only just begun. Their names were Margaret Hale and Eliza Hale, sisters, widows, exhausted beyond dignity. When Elias reached them, snow had already begun to fall in sharp, biting needles. Margaret, the older one at 36, stood tall despite the wind. Her dark hair was streaked with early gray, her jaw set with stubborn pride. Eliza, only 30, was smaller, fair-haired, trembling so hard her teeth nearly sang against each other. "Please," Eliza whispered, her voice thin as frost. "We were told there's a man who lives here." Elias said nothing. Margaret swallowed her pride and forced the words out. "We don't want trouble, just shelter." Until spring, he stared at them, really stared. Their boots were worn through, their hands raw and cracked, their eyes hungry, not just for food, for safety. He had not spoken in months, but the storm behind them roared like a warning. "If you stay out here," he said at last, his voice rough, unused, almost breaking from disuse, "you'll die before nightfall." The sound of his own voice startled him. Eliza let out a small, shaky laugh of relief that almost turned into weeping. Margaret closed her eyes for half a second, as if thanking heaven without daring to say it aloud. They had walked for 4 days from a mining town that had chewed them up and spat them out. Margaret's husband had died in a cave-in. Eliza's had succumbed to fever that burned him alive from the inside. Work for women alone paid in crumbs. The landlord demanded rent or something far worse. They chose the mountains instead. Ha ha ha, what foolish courage grief can give. Elias led them to his cabin without another word. Inside, the space felt suddenly smaller. 3 pairs of boots by the door, 3 breaths clouding the cold air, 3 heartbeats in a place that had known only one. "You may stay," he said stiffly. "Until the pass is clear." Margaret nodded firmly. "We won't be a burden," Eliza whispered, "thank you," like it was the most precious word she owned. Elias turned away quickly. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. So did the way Eliza looked at him, not with fear but with hope. Hope was dangerous. That night, as the blizzard swallowed the valley whole, Elias lay awake listening to the soft murmur of their breathing from the other side of the room. His silence had been his shield, now it had cracks, and winter was only beginning. Winter did not arrive gently, it attacked. By December, snow buried the cabin windows. The world outside disappeared into white silence, broken only by the scream of wind and the cracking of frozen timber in the forest. The mountains became a prison of ice. Inside the cabin, something stranger was happening. Life. Margaret took control of the kitchen by the second morning, without asking, without apology. She reorganized his shelves, scrubbed his iron pots, and turned his tasteless stew into something rich and warm. The first time Elias tasted it, he paused mid-chew. "It's just herbs," she said, trying to sound casual. He grunted. But he finished every bite. Eliza was different, softer, quieter. She found the small stack of worn books Elias kept near his bed and handled them as if they were treasure. In the evenings, she read aloud by lantern light, her voice smooth and steady. Sometimes she laughed at a line in a story, and the sound filled the cabin like sunlight. Ha ha ha, it startled Elias every time. He had forgotten what laughter sounded like inside his walls. "You've lived here alone all these years?" she asked one night. "Yes, not lonely," he hesitated. "No, it was a lie." Margaret noticed everything. The way Elias' coffee was ready before he woke. The way she left his gloves near the fire to warm before he stepped outside. She asked about his traps, about the wolves he tracked, about the eagle that nested above the ridge. He found himself answering, at first in single words, then sentences, then stories, stories he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. He did not speak of Missouri, he did not speak of Lillian. Some wounds stayed buried under snow too deep to disturb, but something inside him was thawing. One evening in late January, a fierce gust slammed the cabin door open. Eliza gasped and rushed to close it, slipping on the icy floor. Elias caught her before she hit the ground. For a moment they stood too close. Her breath warm against his neck, her hands gripping his coat. She looked up at him, eyes wide, not afraid but searching. Margaret saw it. And something flickered across her face, so quick, so quiet, it might have been imagination. That night the wind howled louder than ever. But inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was beginning to gather. And none of them yet understood how powerful it would become. By February, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty, it was full, full of glances that lingered a little too long, full of pauses that carried meaning, full of unspoken questions that hovered in the warm air above the fire. Elias noticed it first in Margaret. She had always moved with purpose, strong, steady, unshaken. But now sometimes he would catch her watching him while he sharpened his knife or repaired a snare. Not boldly, not foolishly, just thoughtfully. Once, when he returned from checking traps with snow in his beard and frost clinging to his coat, she stepped forward without thinking and brushed the ice from his collar. Her fingers lingered. "You'll freeze if you don't let me mend that tear," she said, nodding at his sleeve. "I've survived worse," he replied. She gave a small laugh. "Yes, you have." Eliza's change was quieter but deeper. She began saving passages from books to read just to him. Not both of them, him. Her voice would soften at certain lines, almost trembling, and sometimes she would glance up mid-sentence to see if he was listening. He always was. One night she read about a man who believed his heart had turned to stone, only to discover it still beat fiercely beneath the surface. She stopped reading suddenly. "Do you believe hearts can change?" she asked. Elias stared into the fire. "Stone doesn't soften," he said. Eliza smiled gently. "Sometimes it only looks like stone." Margaret was quiet that evening. The next morning the tension felt different, sharper. The sisters began whispering when Elias stepped outside. Their conversation stopped when he entered the room. Their eyes met in silent exchanges he could not interpret. He felt it building, something inevitable. He hated that feeling. He had built his life to avoid inevitability, to avoid needing anyone, to avoid the very thing growing inside his cabin. One afternoon, as snow melted slowly from the roof, Margaret stood at the window, watching him split wood. Eliza joined her. "He doesn't see it," Eliza murmured. "Oh, he sees it," Margaret replied softly. "He just doesn't know what to do with it." Elias swung the axe harder than necessary, as if he could split the tension along with the logs. Spring was approaching, and with it a decision none of them were ready to make, but it was coming, and when it did, it would demand more than survival. March crept in quietly. The snow began to loosen its grip, icicles thinned. The river beneath the ice started to murmur again, like it was waking from a long sleep. Inside the cabin, no one felt at ease. Margaret had grown more silent, not cold, just watchful. Eliza's laughter came less often now, replaced by long stretches of thoughtfulness. And Elias, he felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, aware that one step would change everything. One evening after supper, Margaret stood up first. The scrape of her chair against the wooden floor sounded louder than it should have. Eliza, she said gently. Eliza rose too. Elias felt it before a single word was spoken. This was the moment. Margaret folded her hands in front of her, steady but pale. The passes will clear soon, he nodded once. We can't go back, she continued. There's nothing for us down there, no safety. No future. Eliza stepped closer to her sister. We found something here, she said softly, something we didn't expect. Elia's jaw tightened. Margaret drew a breath that trembled just slightly. We're not foolish, Elias. We know what's happened this winter. Silence. The fire cracked. Eliza's eyes shone, not with tears yet, but close. We both care for you. There it was, plain, honest, vulnerable. Margaret continued, her voice strong despite the tremor beneath it. We've spoken about it. We won't let it come between us. We're sisters before anything else. Elias felt the air grow thin. Eliza swallowed. If you wish for one of us to stay as your wife, Margaret finished the sentence, you must choose. The words fell heavy in the room. Choose, ha ha ha, what a cruel word. Elias stared at them both. Margaret steady, capable, fierce as winter. Eliza gentle, bright, warm as spring. They stood side by side, not rivals, but offerings. His chest tightened painfully. He remembered another choice made long ago, a choice that had shattered him without mercy. He remembered the letter. The humiliation, the silence that followed for decades, and now they were asking him to create that same wound between them. The fire snapped loudly, making Eliza flinch. Well, Margaret asked, her voice barely steady now. Outside, snow slid from the roof with a heavy thud. Inside, Elias Boone opened his mouth to answer, and what he said next would bind their fates forever. Elias did not answer right away. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Eliza. Two women who had climbed into his valley half dead, who had filled his silent cabin with warmth and stubborn hope. Two women who now stood before him, hearts laid bare, asking him to cut one of them away. His hands trembled. I will not choose. The words came low, firm. Margaret blinked. Eliza's breath caught sharply. You must, Margaret whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. No, he said again, stronger now. I will not set one of you above the other. Silence pressed in around them. Eliza's eyes filled first, not dramatic tears, just quiet, shining ones that slipped down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, almost embarrassed. Is it because you don't care? She asked softly. That question hit harder than any accusation. Elias took a step forward. It is because I do care, Margaret's jaw tightened. You can't keep both of us, Elias. The world doesn't work that way. The world, he replied, his voice roughening, has never worked kindly for any of us. He turned away for a moment, running a hand through his gray beard. I know what it is to be the one not chosen. I know how that scar feels when it never closes. He looked back at them, eyes brighter now, not from anger, but from something dangerously close to pain. I will not create that wound between sisters. Eliza began to weep openly now, though she tried to hide it with a small laugh that broke in her throat. Then what are you saying? I am saying, he breathed, stay, both of you stay here, build something with me, not as rivals, not as prizes. Margaret stared at him, stunned. I am no husband, he continued. I have lived alone too long to pretend I know how to divide myself, but I can offer safety, a home, loyalty, his voice faltered slightly, and perhaps companionship. The fire popped loudly as if reacting. Margaret looked at Eliza. Years of shared grief passed silently between them. This would be strange, Margaret murmured. Eliza gave a small, trembling smile. We've survived worse than strange. Elias stood still, waiting. Waiting for them to decide if his refusal to choose was mercy or cowardice. After what felt like forever, Margaret reached for her sister's hand, then both of them looked at him and nodded. But none of them understood yet what that agreement would truly cost, because choosing not to choose was its own kind of vow. Spring arrived slowly, like it was unsure whether it was welcome. Snow retreated in patches. The river broke free from ice with a sound like deep sighing. For the first time in months, sunlight lingered longer than the cold. and the three of them remained, no wedding, no vows spoken before a preacher. Just a quiet understanding sealed in that small cabin. The first days felt awkward, almost fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter what they had decided. Margaret adjusted first, she always did. She expanded the garden plot behind the cabin, planting rows of vegetables with military precision. "If we are staying," she said firmly, "we will thrive." Eliza painted the window frames with leftover berry stain, adding soft color to the rough wood. "If we are staying," she whispered one afternoon, smiling faintly, "it should feel like home." Elias built. He expanded the cabin walls outward, hammer striking wood with renewed purpose, a larger kitchen for Margaret. A small reading nook by the east window for Eliza, a wider porch where all three could sit when summer came. He worked until his muscles screamed, and for the first time in years, he welcomed the exhaustion. There were moments of tension, of course. One evening, Elias returned from the forest to find Margaret and Eliza arguing in hushed but sharp voices. "It's not about him," Margaret insisted. "It is," Eliza replied, tears threatening again. They fell silent when Elias stepped inside. He understood then. Even without jealousy, even without competition, the heart is not simple. It bends, it aches, it questions. Later that night, he found Margaret sitting alone outside. "Regret?" he asked quietly. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "No, just learning." Eliza inside traced her fingers over the pages of a book but did not read. When Elias sat beside her, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. No promises, no labels, just warmth. Days became weeks. Weeks folded into months. Something unexpected grew between them, not romance with fire and possession, but something steadier. A bond stitched from shared labor, shared meals, shared winters survived. Margaret stopped looking at him as a prize. Eliza stopped waiting for fairy tales. Elias stopped fearing closeness. And yet, in quiet moments, each of them still wondered what might have been if he had chosen differently. But that question was buried under the life they were building together, or so they hoped, because time has a way of testing even the most unusual piece. Years passed like seasons rolling over the peaks. The cabin no longer looked like a hermit's shelter. It looked lived in, loved in. Laughter echoed off its beams. The garden flourished beyond anything the valley had seen. Travelers who stumbled upon the place would blink in disbelief at the sight of three figures working side by side with quiet harmony. They called it strange, unnatural, ha. People always fear what they cannot name. But inside those walls, life found its rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn every day, steady as ever, tending to the animals and kneading dough with hands that never seemed to tire. She aged with strength, her once stark hair silvering fully, but her back never bent. Eliza filled the evenings with stories and music hummed under her breath. She read to Elias even after he insisted he could read on his own. "It sounds better this way," she would tease softly. And Elias, he changed most of all. He laughed, not loudly, not often, but enough. Sometimes, when Margaret scolded him for tracking mud across the floor, he would raise both hands in mock surrender, and Eliza would giggle like a girl half her age. He had not known such simple joy was possible. They were not husband and wives in the way townsfolk understood. There was no jealousy left, no counting of affection. What grew between them was steadier than passion. It was loyalty. It was choice made every morning again without needing to be spoken. One summer evening, as the sun melted gold across the mountains, they sat on the porch together. Eliza leaned against Elias. Margaret rested her feet on the railing, arms folded. "We are a scandal somewhere," Margaret muttered with dry amusement. Elias grunted. "Good." Eliza smiled. "Do you ever regret it?" The question hung gently. Elias looked at the two women who had walked into his storm years ago. "No," he said simply, and he meant it, but life does not pause just because happiness has settled in. Winter came again. And this time it brought something far crueler than snow. The winter of 1898 arrived early, too early. The first frost came before the harvest was fully gathered. The wind carried a strange bite to it, sharper than usual, as if the mountains themselves were uneasy. Eliza fell ill first. It began as a cough, soft, dismissible. I've endured worse, she insisted with a faint smile, brushing off Margaret's concern. But within days, fever burned through her like wildfire. Her skin turned pale against the pillow, her breath shallow and uneven. The cabin, once warm with laughter, filled instead with the sound of labored breathing and whispered prayers. Elias sat beside her through the nights, rough hands trembling as he pressed cool cloths to her forehead. You must rest, Margaret urged him quietly. He shook his head. Eliza opened her eyes one evening and found him watching her like a man watching the sun set for the last time. You look frightened, she whispered weakly. I am not, he replied automatically. She smiled faintly. Liar, ha ha ha. Even then, she found the strength to tease him. Margaret stood at the stove, shoulders rigid. She did not cry, not yet. She moved with purpose, brewing herbs, tending fire, fighting a battle she knew she could not win. The fever worsened, snow piled high outside, sealing the valley in silence once more. One night when the wind howled against the shutters, Eliza reached for Elia's hand. Thank you, she murmured. For what? His voice cracked. For not choosing. The words broke something inside him. Tears fell freely now, unhidden, unashamed. He pressed her hand to his face as if he could hold her there by sheer will. I was never unchosen, she whispered. I was loved, her breathing slowed. Margaret stepped closer, gripping Elia's shoulder as if to keep herself standing, and just like that she was gone. The cabin felt enormous afterward, empty. Elias buried Eliza on the hill overlooking the valley she had once admired through the window. He carved her name himself, hands steady despite the storm inside his chest. She found light in the mountains. Margaret stood beside him, silent, her face carved from stone, but grief is patient, and it was not finished yet. After Eliza's passing, the cabin never sounded the same. No soft reading by lantern light, no gentle humming while bread baked, just wind and memory. Margaret endured, she always had, but something in her grew quieter, not broken, never broken, but softened by grief. She moved through the cabin with steady determination, yet Elias often caught her pausing by Eliza's empty chair, fingers brushing its back like she could still feel her sister's warmth. They did not speak much of sorrow. They did not need to. It lived with them. 3 winters later, on a calm spring morning, Margaret rose before dawn as she always had. She began preparing breakfast. Elias smelled coffee brewing and almost smiled, almost. He found her seated at the table, hands folded gently in front of her, head bowed as if in thought. Margaret, he called softly, no answer. He stepped closer, her face was peaceful, calm. As though she had simply closed her eyes for a moment of rest, but her heart had already stopped. This time Elias did not weep loudly. He knelt beside her and pressed his forehead to her hands, shoulders shaking in silence. The mountains outside stood indifferent, bathed in golden light. He buried her beside Eliza on the hill. She made a home where none had been. 2 graves now, 2 pieces of his heart resting beneath wild grass. The years that followed felt longer than all the others combined. Elias remained in the cabin, though it felt far too large for one man again. He would sit on the porch at sunset, staring at the mountains they had shared. The silence had returned. But it was different now. It was not protection, it was absence. In the spring of 1904, Elias Boone was found seated in his chair on that porch, eyes closed, face tilted toward the peaks he had loved for nearly 60 years. He was smiling. In his coat pocket, the townsfolk found a folded letter. It said he had once been asked to choose. It said choosing would have meant losing. It said love was not a number, not something divided like land or coin. It said he had been saved the day he refused, and it said he was finally going to join his family again. They buried him between the 2 sisters, 3 headstones, 1 story. And the mountains still whisper it when the wind passes through. Sometimes the bravest choice is refusing to choose at all.